Welcome to the MSDW podcast. I'm Jason Gumpert, editor at msdynamicsworld.com. On this episode, we are talking organizational change management and the implications for Microsoft Business Applications customers. My guests are John Dorrian and Hannah Whiteside of Pendo, a software firm focused on user adoption and employee experience. John is a company executive who helps shape strategy on partnerships with system integrators and a significant focus on Microsoft applications. And Hannah is a leader in the field of organizational change management and joined the company as one of its leaders on strategy for employee experience. Pendo is the sponsor of this episode, and we explore what makes the timeless topic of organizational change management unique in today's business climate. For Microsoft customers, there are some unique challenges today. Microsoft Teams is an important system that might replace a range of older apps and processes, and the adoption of Power Apps has introduced its own set of challenges that we talk about, like measuring uptake, picking winners and losers among apps that have been developed, and the structures that make a Power Apps practice successful. We also talk about where compliance needs fit into Pendo's story and some of the other scenarios where change management is so crucial today, like in M&A. All right. Well, Hannah Whiteside, John Dorrian, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're excited.
Yeah, well, I wanted to start with really kind of the big picture when it comes to organizational change management and perhaps, some of the latest thinking that you and your organization, Pendo, have around it. I mean, as I think back, it's something that has certainly been around for years and years, the idea of introducing change and both maybe the psychological and social and technical and, sort of executive management concerns that go into it. Hannah, maybe I'll start with you when it comes to your view on change management and how you communicate that to your customers and kind of communicate it through your solutions. How do you frame it up?
So at its core, change management has historically been the analog way through email, through getting people's buy-in, through delivering training, what started as sort of stand and deliver training, classroom training, and driving people through a major change. Change is uncomfortable, and change management exists as a practice to help people become more comfortable with it and understand what they need to do differently in the future. So it's really just driving someone from a current state to a future state. I think what's changing with this field is that people have always said, oh, change is so hard. Change is hard because it's not predictable, meaning that when you know where to go for information, when you feel like you are being served up the tools and resources you need to get through change, then change is very comfortable. I think about the difference between if you've ever been ready when the movers arrive versus when you're not. Someone who maybe knew for months that they were building a house, they were getting ready, they packed up their house really nicely, they labeled every box, they made sure that their kitchen valuables were actually packaged appropriately in advance. And then the movers come and they take everything and everything ends up in the room that they anticipated it. You would ask that person, oh, how hard was your move? How uncomfortable was that? Oh, it was great. It went really smooth because there was planning, there was documentation, everything was organized versus frankly, as much as it seems a service to hire movers to pack everything for you, everything's thrown in boxes. You didn't go through any of your cupboards beforehand, and you have no idea where things are going to end up. And so then after the fact, there's that stress, that anxiety of the not knowing where things are in your life. And so I think really all that digital adoption is at its core, and like what Pendo is organizing things that were previously difficult to organize.
I love the moving analogy. I have to pack up some room soon, and it's certainly on my mind having enough boxes and not creating chaos in the family's life. One of the things you've talked about also, Hannah, in terms of maybe a concern in some organizations, especially in the last year and a half, is not that people don't use the tools they have, but they're actually gaining too many tools. The companies perhaps are, if not overcompensating, they're introducing tools, even good tools, at either too fast a rate or just bringing too many into the mix at once, and that itself can become a risk that has to be sort of mitigated. Does that sort of summarize that concern well?
Yeah, I think it's both companies, IT organizations are proactively sourcing tools to complete certain tasks. And there is a proliferation of what I would call rogue tool license purchasing. I think a lot of individuals have felt empowered to purchase the tools that they think they need. But as a result, you're seeing a huge amount of both official and unofficial license proliferation within organizations.
I can imagine that creates some instability and that maybe your teams witness this when you work with clients.
Yeah, it introduces a ton of instability, partially because one of the better examples is Slack. You see at a lot of companies where a team will sign up for Slack licenses or other collaboration tools, and they all are purchasing the same tool, but then they set it up and configure it differently for their use cases. And so then eventually an organization tries to reconcile this massive proliferation of licenses and says, hey, we actually need an enterprise version of XYZ tool. How do we combine that? And you realize that everyone's been using it differently. Everyone is very sensitive to the use case and the way they set it up because they like it that way. And so now you're dealt with it's not even necessarily a tool change. It's just like, hey, we all need to start working the same way and collaborate in this consistent manner to get the most out of this tool. And there's a lot of resistance to those kind of efforts. But at the same time, that's the IT. That's what IT needs to do as a cost center. That's how we drive cost savings in the business, is we have to do those things. JD, anything to add?
Yeah, I love starting discussions like this with a metaphor, and I think I'll build on your house metaphor. I mean, just imagine you woke up one morning and, your partner was different, your son, daughter was different. I'll even say your dog was different. That's a people-driven change management situation. You'd have to teach them how to do all of the things that are completely second nature to us, or even if you want to sort of err on the side of systems as opposed to people, if all of a sudden you woke up and, your coffee machine was different, your thermostat was different, and a variety of other things, I'll say, quote unquote, mechanical or digital within your house, again, there's a learning curve and there's a forgetting curve pinned to all of these things. And these are challenges that really, if you can get rid of even just a fraction of them, can drive efficiencies. So, whether it's optimizing people-driven or systems-driven change management, and I think we should probably, at some point in this conversation, weave in compliance-driven change management. Yeah, I mean, it has to be a focus of an organization. It's an absolute must.
Well, I'd love to kind of bring it back to just talking some of the different specific products out there that are really making an impact in the world. You mentioned Slack. Obviously, that's one that most people are going to recognize at this point. And, in the Microsoft space, there's Teams. But I know that for the purposes of this conversation, one of the areas that your team has been investing in and obviously paying close attention to is Microsoft's Power Platform and Dynamics 365 business applications as sort of an area where products are being deployed, where solutions are being deployed in various ways at various companies, perhaps running some of those risks around individual teams and individual groups within a larger corporate structure doing their own thing. I'm not sure who wants to maybe take a stab at this, but I'd love to get your perspective on what you see or how you first took on perspective on the Microsoft kind of landscape here and what it really needs for change management and adoption.
I'll start, and then JD, I'd love for you to jump in as well. As a change practitioner, I was involved in an Office 365 transformation in my most recent role prior to joining Pendo. And part of the reason I actually use Slack and not a Microsoft example is because Microsoft actually has a pretty structured architecture in how you acquire licenses and set up your organization for success. But as a result, it typically is more of a lift and shift, meaning that someone is going from a single set of platforms and an architecture, a business architecture, and they are moving on to the Microsoft architecture, at least in my experience. And as a result, it feels like a more complex change in the moment. And so what I mean by that is as simple as the shift from, say, a company that was on Skype for Business or one of the older platforms, the pre-Teams platforms, and going to a Microsoft Teams environment. They're not identical. use cases. Someone may have been just doing old school IMing, group chat, things of that nature. And now you have this like so much more robust platform in Microsoft Teams, for example, and there's so much more potential in it, but uncovering and discovering that potential in the platform to actually achieve the business value out of it is hard, because someone goes, I knew how to do this, and I guess I'll go do that this way. They're just thinking one for one. They're not thinking, I used to do this, and outside of my Skype for Business or my old school platform, I also would use SharePoint not online, and I would do data storage here, or I would create certain SharePoint sites and I would store information that way. And now all of that's interconnected in my Microsoft Teams environment. How I do documents, how I create, how I co-author is all sort of in this one single pane of glass experience. And so getting someone to do that mental shift from what was previously potentially, I have to go out to different places, and now I can go to one place. Think of the difference between I used to go to many different retail stores to buy what I need, and now I'm going just to Amazon to get everything I need. That's the same internal experience someone goes through when they shift to a more powerful single pane of glass or single entity experience, like a lot of the Microsoft products. Is I used to go out to many different places to do all these things that now one or two tools can do. And so helping someone transition from one architecture to the other is really challenging.
I'll just add something in quickly. I think as an operational leader at an enterprise, the biggest mistake or the riskiest approach you can take is going with gut feel and going with almost operating in a comfort zone, right? What you need to do is challenge yourself with data, right? Because you need to make a data-enabled decision to drive the right business decision and the correct change. So just sort of woven into everything that Hannah just mentioned, which was, focus specifically on Microsoft. I just think in general, gut feel is very risky and oftentimes causes you much more work. And, lack of data. Don't make big decisions without copious amounts of data would be my comment.
And actually, to that point, JD, the thing is that one individual who is working across 3, 4, 5 things that they can now do in a single way with Teams, that one person is not duplicated across an organization. Each individual works across different systems. So how do you know who's following what processes to achieve what result today in the current state is almost impossible to uncover. And so the data to then set up your Microsoft Teams environment or your analytics environment or any of these other environments is pre-dependent on having the data and the user behavior data to inform, how do I want to configure this tool? How do I want to set it up? How do I then want to train on it? So there are so many decisions you make at the point of implementation that if you don't really deeply understand the current state of how people work today, are made that much harder because you're thumb in the airing it, your gut feel. And that's the risk, is you're actually going to invest huge amounts of project management resources because these implementations are potentially, you have a system implementer, you have your internal project management office, you have your tech teams. You're investing in a certain way to configure and set up based on assumptions of how people work as opposed to actual data to back that up.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to bring it back to like Dynamics and Power Platform, I mean, from my perspective, one of the things that's always been a strength from what implementers say and what customers say is flexibility. Power Platform, when that sort of spun out, I guess you'd call it, from originally Dynamics products and really became its own entity unto itself now, with obviously still with a lot of connection. It even just blew the doors off of the idea that there's any sort of rigid structure to what an enterprise system has to have if you're invested in the Microsoft space, that it can really be all sorts of entity relationships, all sorts of, types of data being stored in new and interesting ways. It's exciting if you're building apps, but it almost just to me, it almost like threw the rule book for adoption out the window, because any application could be coming out from any organization at this point. And Microsoft's done some around that. But what is your perspective when you sort of look at that in comparison to, other types of systems that Pendo supports or works with? Is it pretty much the same, or is it unique in any sort of ways? Hannah, do you want to take this?
I think about right now, there are a lot of, in enterprise organizations, there's this move toward scaled agile, not just agile. Agile used to be just like each product team working independently, but we're now finding, and then you can develop your own processes, and there's this flexibility to agile, right? And how you set yourself up as an agile team, because it's developer led. And in many ways, the Power Platform is a branch off of that same methodology and that same thinking that we want to enable in this way that meets the needs of the people using it. But as a result, when those different teams came together and are now have dependencies and dependency management and shared roadmaps, there are issues. So I think, and that's why the Scaled Agile framework was sort of like developed in that way. And you're seeing organizations move towards Scaled Agile. And I think in that same way, you're looking at not just change management at the point of we're putting this platform in for this team, or we're going to use this part of the Microsoft Power Platform suite for this team. But you're saying, how does this all come together? And what is that enterprise architecture? What is that enterprise change management model, so that we all understand how everyone is working and can better collaborate? And in a distributed workforce, this is made just that much harder.
Just think of yourself being a CIO at a large company, global or otherwise. The notion of a low code platform, sort of epitomizes double-edged sword, right? You have on one side, you have, holy cow, I'm going to save a ridiculous amount of money and a ridiculous amount of resources by enabling people to solve their own problems, right? Like, I don't want anyone that's underneath my umbrella as a CIO to go necessarily become a subject matter expert in accounts payable to develop an accounts payable app. That's not the best use of time, money, resources. And, I could almost restate the other side of the sword, or the other edge of the sword, with the exact same thing. It's like, holy cow, I have people in accounts payable and marketing and logistics building all these applications. Like, how does this not turn into the wild, wild west? And how do we know that, we're in, compliance with internal policy or regulatory policy? How do we understand who is developing what, who is using what? And, that's the flip side. That's the scary side of the low code platform. And having a way to audit that is a great benefit. And, having a way just to understand and be able to get data off of who is doing what is critical and should be part of, I don't think every organization needs to have necessarily a tech stack center of excellence or a low code center of excellence, but having that data to be used to understand where to mitigate risk. And then conversely, like, holy cow, what's working great? And let's try and scale that so we have even more delightful outcomes. That's where my head's at around this whole notion.
Sure. One of the things I can imagine when it comes to, well, really all enterprise systems, but Power Apps is particularly interesting to me because, you could just have 10 apps sitting out there, and maybe one is a really good one, right? People have started using it and they're getting great productivity benefits out of it. And it didn't take the IT team any work. Someone out in the business, subject matter expert, developed it, right? And it's a hit, and it's proven to be a real success in helping people. And then maybe you have 3 in the middle that are helping a little bit, but they've also got some issues. And then you have, what did I say, 10? So then you have maybe 6 that are really losers, and they're used by a few people who built them, and everyone else doesn't want to touch it, or they're using it and it's even making their work lives harder. I don't know. So you have like this distribution of successful and unsuccessful apps. What's the sort of the balance there when it comes to actually taking action? Either some of them maybe are good but need some training, some of them IT needs to step in and say, you got to get rid of this, or I don't know. Do you put any measurements to that, or particular tools to help?
Frankly, I think it comes down, or should come down, to spend. Even when an app is built in a low cost way, there are tons of infrastructure costs. There are data center costs, there are security costs, there are networking costs. there are costs, there are other extraneous costs. And I think when you start to have a ton of tech debt, you need to build a system to retire applications that are not serving you and serving your business. And so I think it really starts with looking at your spend portfolio, identifying areas where you see maybe the 5 people using it are using it in a very data heavy way. And they could be using a tool that costs less and stores data differently, right? And so there are ways that you start with spend, you identify the business need. So you need to then say, what was this designed for, right? Like someone designed the app for some problem statement at some point. And we need to validate, is that problem statement still a problem? Maybe someone built a homegrown app at a time when there wasn't a more robust solution, and now there is. And so I think a big part of this is going back and revalidating your spend, looking at, is the business problem still a problem? And if it isn't, did the app solve it or did something else? And then really it's about that transition. Okay, so we need to get these people off this and onto something that will serve their needs better, or just won't have the same impact to the business. And so that's where things like with Pendo, in-app messaging, guidance, driving people off of the current state onto the desired app, the one app that you said is really killing it, is the best path forward. And so it takes with being really specific and going, we're going to audit this set of applications this quarter, and we're going to make some decisions. And these are all of our finance apps, and we really want to understand how these are being used. And then we want to audit this set of our portfolio. And maybe it's because there's another ask coming from finance to invest in another large technology investment of some kind. And you go, okay, well, let's balance out our portfolio. It's about keeping your portfolio in balance, both from a user perspective and making sure you're meeting your user goals, your business goals, and frankly, you're maximizing your IT costs and your return on investment.
That makes sense. I don't know if this was what you were referring to, but one thing that occurred to me as you said that was the idea that maybe even like kind of monitoring and detecting use of a legacy system, or even like an element of it that the organization really wanted people to stop using, and sort of nudging them to say, hey, you should be now using the new AP, I don't know, forms or workflow. But it's over there now, even though we see that you're still here. Is that ever a case?
Oh, yeah. And this is less of a Microsoft example and more of a COVID example. But at my previous company, we've had a few different ways to remote in to your systems. And because of COVID, we really hesitated to turn off certain pathways to do that, even though there was like a better pathway that had gone live. And we hit a point where we're like, for cost reasons, for security reasons, for like all the right IT business case reasons, we just had to get people off of it. And so in our case, without a digital adoption solution, we were sending emails, we were detecting usage, we were crunching numbers, we were like trying to figure out like who was still using this thing. It was an incredibly laborious process, but like systematically, we had to get people off of the two tools we did not want them using anymore for remote access. And there was so much anxiety. I'm working from home. We don't want to break anyone who's working from home, but we had to just like make them really comfortable and make sure that we weren't going to break anyone's ways of working, and make sure they could all still do their day jobs while transitioning to the better solution. And you had to do that in like a highly systemic way. Frankly, companies just don't retire stuff enough because they're like afraid to kind of probably upset one of their end users or their business populations. But I think this is, with data, it's easier to say, you are not achieving the value out of this that you think you are. You are not getting, the behaviors are not supported by like high productivity, that your app is not supporting the things that we wanted it to. And so right now, the reason people don't deprecate more apps is because it's sort of this like mom and dad are fighting situation where like IT is dad and mom is the business. And there's that tension there around we don't want to upset the business, and IT without good data to point to user metrics, processes that are in play, return on investment, et cetera, doesn't often have a good leg to stand on. And so like, how do you better empower IT to have critical conversations with their business teams? And like, that's the power of user-driven analytics.
And forced deprecation, I think most people have a knee-jerk reaction to pin a negative connotation on it. But, you know, if forced deprecation is backed by insights and data, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's going to accelerate the path towards a positive outcome. And we were talking about portfolios earlier. I mean, like any type of portfolio, an art portfolio, a financial or stock portfolio, or an IT portfolio, like if things aren't working out, like unload them, right? Like, you know, if you know there's no market pull for some painting in your art portfolio, you know, get rid of it and focus on something else that's going to ultimately deliver more value to you. But it's really challenging. Like, you know, we've been working with a large wireless provider, and they have hundreds of Power App developers across their organization. So it's essentially like a Power Platform champions team, and the dev group is a few hundred folks. And when they do go to sort of, you know, upvote, downvote these applications, they're going off much less so data and more so just anecdotal gut feel. And it's sort of a frustrating manual process for them historically. And we're working with them to change that, frankly.
What are some of the things you would really like to see them achieve in a sort of an ideal state in that kind of scenario?
Ideal state, a couple of things. Like, number one, look at the developers and pattern match the folks that are making the most widely adopted and the most business impactful applications, right? Identify who those people are, that sort of subset, or you would think it's going to be a smaller cohort, right? And help other app makers sort of build and behave in a way like that power cohort. That's number one. And then number two, I would say actually being able to leverage these applications I'll give you a good example. Another large enterprise, right? We were working with them. They're a large Power App community as well within the four walls of that company. And they said, holy cow, like we can embed Pendo into these applications and also survey people based on how they're using these applications, or survey people based on their role and seniority within our company. We can actually, if we can do that, we can get rid of other investments that we have, other third-party investments that we have, because, you know, all of a sudden we're not just checking one box in a tactical way, we're checking many boxes, and, you know, a correct technology that serves change management and digital adoption is essentially becoming like, it is inching towards a core nucleus of optimizing process. So those are two higher level themes there.
In your experiences with companies working with Power Platform and even Dynamics 365 applications, have you had any exposure to sort of their primary Microsoft partners and what their role has been in, you know, guiding some of these tough decisions or some of these challenges when it comes to, you know, doing a good job with deploying Power Apps, for example? And if so, what is an ideal role, or what are some ideal skills that the sort of primary Microsoft partner should be bringing to that kind of engagement?
I think what you're seeing with a lot of these, you know, advisory teams, you know, specific tech stack advisory, like a Microsoft practice at a large SI, or more of a functional practice at an SI like organization and talent management, is they're addressing all of the, they're almost thinking like we do at Pendo, frankly, which is a pretty nice match. They're saying, holy cow, you know, people are using close to 80 applications every day comparatively at some organizations. Like, number one, that's not healthy. That's not healthy business. That's not healthy process. Number two, let's begin to sort of inventory and scope what's being used, why it's being used, and then ultimately and inherently it becomes an exercise of deprecation. And I think we've said the word deprecate a couple of times at this point. No one's in the business of specifically, you know, in a nefarious way to drive organizations to use less technology. but we should all be in the business of optimizing everything within an organization. That'll just drive healthier business across the board and have better downstream effects. So when we at Pendo talk to SIs, it's a patchwork of technology centric dialogue, right, around specific technology stacks, and then organizational management and how human beings are interacting with the tech.
Yeah, I think to JD's point, they're doing it the same way as we're recommending. They are just doing it sometimes with just the analog way. They're going in, they're doing discovery, they're having focus groups, they're looking at current state analysis through shadowing and process maps. And it's the assumed. Like, what's really hard about being an SI today is a lot of the time your clients are providing you with presumptive process documentation, meaning like, this is the process as we've defined it. I have yet to work in an organization where that's ever been accurate because people don't follow process. People are not consistent.
How has that changed over the last 20 years? I mean, that sounds like something you could have said in the year 2000 or earlier.
It hasn't changed. The only difference is that technology enables process. And so technology is effectively a very powerful tool that provides people to follow a process. But it's not always prescriptive, and it's not always clear what those process steps are. Sometimes it is in the best tools as they're developed, but sometimes it's not. And so you're going to have people, even the way fields are named, there's a lot of time it's open for interpretation, and humans are humans, and we come at things with our own biases. We come at things with our own language so that we bring to it and we go, oh, I would describe it this way. And someone's like, I would never describe it that way. And so it comes down to these governance moments, these compliance moments, are we actually following the process as designed, as intended, as optimized? And frankly, even the best process architects, someone else might find a better way to do things who's the end user when they live it and breathe it every day and they've built skill and ability in it. So it's, how do you reconcile all of this human behavior in the context of trying to architect a process, trying to design and implement a system? It's just a heavy lift today. And I think SIs do an amazing job. Some of the best ones do an excellent job just going in and doing this like really robust discovery. And the question is like, the way of the future should be not discovery. Discovery is frankly like, it's lower level thinking. It's, let me just try to understand the landscape here. What we want people at SIs being able to do is the strategic thinking. We want them to be good strategic partners who are looking at our business processes and our business problems and able to give us like really good strategic guidance, and people who really know the tools, the Microsoft tools really, really well, and could go, that process would be great using this feature or functionality. We don't want them spending all of our time and frankly our money in discovery. Mm-hmm. And that's what they do today. Like discovery, when I've scoped out RFPs with SIs, when I was on the change management side, that's like, I swear a third or half my budget goes into discovery.
Yeah. It's like, why don't we already know these?
Right. Why don't we as the business know ourselves well enough? Mm-hmm. And it's because we don't have the tools to do that. And we're not providing them the tools. And I think that's kind of where this Pendo partnership was sort of born out of, that problem statement.
Yeah. And I'd like to, I think we're sort of talking about things in a binary right/wrong right now as it relates to process. And, there is such thing as sort of a happy gray area. And, I'll just sort of recant a story. There's an enterprise out there that's a large Microsoft F&O, finance and operations ERP system customer. And as part of their finance team, which is global, spread far and wide, there's a very convoluted process to do a variety of things. And people, John Doe and Jane Doe that have the same title, but maybe, he's in the Philippines and, she's in Chicago. They get from A to B, but they get from A to B in a very, very different path. Yet sometimes they inherit each other's work streams, which was confusing, right? Like if John inherited Jane's work stream, He's like, okay, like I know where I got to go, but I don't know, I don't know where Jane left me off here. And, that gray area is okay as long as you have an intelligent technology helping those users out. So I'm not saying you don't want a lot of gray area, but depending on what the process is, and if it's an easily guidable situation that is, going to ensure, correct data entered and ultimately processes tied off in a timely manner, I would say gray areas can be an okay place.
It's frankly empowering. Like, that's the thing, is employees don't want things to be so prescriptive that they can't diverge from like the prescribed process. But when there is sort of this gray area, which leads to greater employee engagement and empowerment and like this desire to like figure out the best way to do things, it's then making sure we reverse engineer and sort of capture the goodness out of that experimentation and that gray area too.
I wanted to circle back to compliance. It's one of my sort of secret favorite topics in a sense. It's really important for obviously certain segments of the world here. And where does Pendo sort of play in that compliance story?
I'll just start from probably a less obvious place, yet critically important. Just like any legitimate SaaS company, we sort of have security as priority one, and then product adoption, change management as priority 1A, if you will, right? So from that perspective, we are here to be good partners with highly regulated companies that operate in those verticals, which we have many of those. So that's first and foremost. And then just being a compliance value add. Just take the concept of just an audit trail. You will know absolutely who is doing what, clicking where in any application. Who did it, when did they do it, how many times did they do it, what is their role, should they have been eligible to do it, and what risk. Let's quantify the risk from 0 to 1 on that individual's experience. Does that put our organization at any sort of risk? And if so, what? So from building our own SaaS product, we view security and compliance as critical. Pendo has very stringent security standards, SOC 2, Type 2, all 5 trust principles, and go on down the list, right? So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Compliance, and taking it one step further and talking about it potentially even more broadly, compliance is really just like behavioral consistency at its core, meaning that there sometimes needs to be this compliance with filling out a field a consistent way, because otherwise we have bad data, and bad data effectively gets into reports, and reports are then used to make business decisions, and we're making business decisions off of effectively a field that probably should have had some compliance structures around it, right? And then there's like big C compliance. That's kind of little c compliance. And then there's big C compliance, which is what you've talked about in sort of that risk and security capacity, which is like in unregulated companies, it's risk in the context of business risk, customer risk, et cetera. And then there are regulated companies where risk comes with fines. It comes with audit and controls. And audit and controls today are even incredibly manually designed, as opposed to having sort of systemic compliance and controls and the ability to actually move beyond training as compliance. And I think today you see a lot of like training activity, which bores everybody in the universe. I've never heard someone like complete annual security training and be like, that was amazing. So how do we achieve the same result? How do we actually prove to whoever is regulating us as a business that like we are following good security practices? How do we show? And so like, I think this is the future, right? Like, I think the future is like cracking this nut. And I think that's something that we at Pendo are hoping and driving toward, working with IT leaders who want to better solve big C compliance use cases.
I did want to also just call out the recent webcast that you did. And I believe as this episode of the podcast goes up, the recording of that probably will be available soon. So to check the notes, we'll put it in there as soon as that's available too. It was a great discussion, Hannah, with Hannah Farley of Hitachi Solutions. And I just wanted to note sort of one thing before we wrap up here. And that was the various scenarios where change management kind of really becomes critical. We just talked about compliance. Maybe that's why I thought of it. But others that you had touched on in that discussion, I thought we could maybe recap a bit. One of the most interesting I thought was M&A. It's something that, you see a ton of it just in this sort of Microsoft space where I tend to pay a lot of attention. There's a lot of it going on here. Obviously, it just happens all over the place. Can you give me your thoughts on M&A and maybe any other really kind of big picture scenarios that are driving change management today?
I do think M&A is one of them because it's so much system complexity coming together. And with so many, a lot of the time, like what is behind M&A is often sometimes talent acquisition, and you are hugely at risk of hemorrhaging talent if their job just became harder just because of systems. And so how you migrate to a new set of systems, even if it's the same set of systems but configured differently, like switching instances of Microsoft CRM, for instance, or combining those, you are at risk every time you do that. And so if you want to retain the intellectual property, the knowledge management components of an M&A, that's in your people, and that's in how you do these system integrations and these system combinations. And so M&A, I think, is a huge factor, and there's risk there's risk associated with not doing this well, right? Like really true business risk, knowledge risk, people risk, et cetera. And then the other one that I think is really common right now is collaboration. We are transforming how businesses collaborate in the hybrid workplace, and it is hugely behavioral driven. If you talk about the success of a collaboration tool, whether that's SharePoint Online or how people create and document sources of truth, discoverability of documentation, that is going to be the biggest drain on productivity in a hybrid workforce. And even not even hybrid, just a distributed workforce, which we were already on that path pre-COVID, is how collaboration and the future of work is going to continue to develop. So I would say those key areas is where change management, any sort of people-driven change, is going to be key.
John, anything else you wanted to add, or either of you that we wanted to touch on before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think we covered a lot today, and it was a great discussion. So, Jason, I just want to, on behalf of Pendo, I just want to thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of the MSDW podcast. My thanks once again to John Dorrian and Hannah Whiteside for joining me. For more information on how to overcome user adoption challenges on your employee-facing applications, visit pendo.io/digital-adoption. That's pendo.io/digital-adoption. And that's it for this episode. If you want to get in touch with me, you can reach me by email, jgumpert@msdynamicsworld.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and on Twitter for all of our latest updates. Until next time, this is MS Dynamics World, signing off.